And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist John Cowen with your marine forecast. We'll start off taking a look at sea ice across our offshore areas of the Alaska coast. Still plenty of open water across much of the Beaufort, into the Chukchi Sea and down across the Bering Strait. We do have some shore-fast ice starting to form. This will be building in over the next few days, however, it still will take a while until we freeze the rest of the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas. Taking a look at tonight's weather, our main systems are going to be these two low pressure centers, the stronger one of which is this low pressure in the Gulf of Alaska, bringing mixed wintry weather to much of the immediate coastline. Some very strong winds expected across much of the open water of the Gulf of Alaska and along the coastline. This weaker system in the western Bering will persist over the next few days, however, bringing some unsettled weather, but winds generally not nearly as strong as what we're experiencing farther to the east. Now, as we look towards the North Slope, we do have some stronger winds associated with high pressure system that's way up in the northern Arctic, bringing some strong winds and some blowing snow and reduced visibility in much of that area. Taking a look at Saturday's weather, still we have our strong winds along much of the North Slope. Our storm in the Gulf of Alaska continues to slowly weaken. However, we still do have some of those stronger winds impacting much of southeastern Alaska. A lot of mixed wintry precipitation as well. Coming back over to the Bering, our storm's still lingering here, continuing to slowly weaken and continuing to produce a lot of rain and snow showers across much of the Aleutians. And then getting into Sunday, low pressure continues to weaken. However, you do see that we have quite a complex system of low pressure systems spanning much of the Gulf of Alaska, North Pacific, into the Bering Sea. The northern half of Alaska still has that stronger high pressure up in the Arctic, so some of those winds continuing to be pretty gusty across much of northwestern Alaska, but generally unsettled weather is what we're looking at for most marine areas for Sunday. Taking a look at our marine forecast for southeast, offshore winds are going to be pretty strong on Saturday. 25 to 30 knots is what we're looking at out of the southeast to east. Seas generally 10 to 15 feet for many areas, pushing 18 feet offshore of Yakutat. And then farther inland, we have about 20 to 25 knots, some stronger gusts in there as well, generally out of the south to southeast with seas around 4 to 5 feet. Getting into Sunday, things calming down a bit. Winds turning out of the southwest for our offshore areas around 30 knots. Seas still pretty high, upwards of 20 to 25 feet for these areas. And then farther inland, again, 15 to 20 knots is what we're looking at out of the south with seas still 3 to 5 feet. Looking at Saturday's forecast for South Central, you can see the Cook Inlet. We still have some strong winds out of the north. 30 to 35 knots is what we're looking at for our offshore areas here. 5 to 10 feet generally is what we're looking at, increasing to 13 feet for these offshore areas here in the North Pacific. Still some very strong winds out of the east and northeast, around 35 to 40 knots, bringing seas up to 15 to 20 feet. And then for Prince William Sound, 30 knots out of the east, seas around 6 feet. Sunday, things calming down again, variable around 5 to 10 knots over Prince William Sound, seas down to 2 feet. In the offshore areas, winds changing out of the west to southwest, around 20 to 25 knots, seas 10 to 12 feet. And then for Cook Inlet, winds changing out of the west to southwest, 10 to 20 knots, seas generally 2 to 4 feet. And then coming over to southwestern Alaska, again, back to on Saturday, some pretty strong winds south to southwest or southeast of Kodiak Island, around 30 knots, seas 15 to 23 feet across this area. And then on the Bering side, winds beginning to calm down by this point Saturday, still around 30 knots or so on the Bering side, but seas generally about 5 to 8 feet. And then for Sunday, much improvement, winds out of the southwest, around 20 knots on the Bering side, seas 5 feet, and on the Pacific side, 15 to 20 knots, seas again 5 to 8 feet. Looking farther west over the far western Bering, generally relatively calm for Saturday across this region. 15 to 25 knots is what we're looking at. Seas generally in that 5 to 12 foot area, the higher seas on the Pacific side. And then as we get into Sunday, winds continuing that downward trend, 15 to 20 knots for most areas, generally out of the south to southwest, and then seas about 5 to 10 feet for most areas. Across the southwestern coast, we're looking at about 15 to 25 knots for most areas. Pretty strong winds out of the north in the offshore areas, but seas generally around 3 to 5 feet or so. And then for Sunday, coming down to 10 to 15 knots, again, seas generally 3 to 5 feet. And across the North Slope, 25 to 30 knots out of the east is what we're looking at for Saturday. Winds, seas about 5 to 7 feet. And then coming over to the Chukchi Sea, increasing to about 35 knots offshore of Cape Lisburne, with those stronger winds there, bringing seas up to about 6 to 10 feet, and then towards the Bering Strait, 20 knots out of the north to northeast, and seas 4 to 6 feet. Generally coming down for Sunday, decreasing to about 30 knots offshore Cape Lisburne, seas down to about 6 to 8 feet in that area, and then across the North Slope, still around 25 to 30 knots with seas generally 4 to 6 feet. And that'll wrap up our marine forecast. I'm meteorologist John Cowen.